The morning Leora Vance's life ended, the sky was the color of old bruises. She stood in the cramped bedroom she'd shared with her younger sister for 19 years, staring at a dress that wasn't hers, white cotton, tea-length, with buttons up the back that her mother's shaking fingers couldn't quite manage. The fabric smelled like lavender and someone else's hopes, borrowed from Mrs. Fletcher down the road, who'd worn it to marry a man she actually loved. "Hold still," her mother whispered, but her voice cracked on the second word. Leora didn't move. Couldn't. Her body had gone numb somewhere around dawn, when she'd woken to the sound of her father pacing the kitchen below, his boots wearing grooves into floorboards already scarred by drought and desperation. 3 weeks ago, she hadn't even known Rhett Calder's name. Now she was supposed to become his wife. "Mama," Leora said quietly, "I don't want to do this." Her mother's hands stilled. For a moment, neither of them breathed. Then her mother's fingers resumed their work, fumbling with the tiny buttons, and when she spoke, her voice was hollow. "None of us want this, baby, but wanting doesn't fill empty bellies." Through the thin walls, Leora could hear her sister Clara crying, soft, muffled sounds that she was trying to hide beneath her pillow. Clara was 14, still young enough to believe in fairy tales and endings that didn't taste like ash. Leora had stopped believing in those the day the drought came. It had started small, just a dry spring, nothing unusual for this part of Montana. But then summer arrived without rain, and the creek that fed their land turned to cracked mud, and the cattle started dying faster than they could bury them. By August, her father had sold everything that wasn't nailed down. By September, he'd started selling things that were. It still wasn't enough. The bank wanted $3,000. Might as well have asked for the moon. And then Rhett Calder had appeared at their door like some dark answer to a prayer nobody had prayed. Leora hadn't been there for the conversation. Her father had sent her to town that day, an errand that, looking back, had probably been designed to keep her away. When she'd returned, her father wouldn't meet her eyes, and her mother had been crying into a dish towel, and the deal had already been struck. Marry Rhett Calder. Debt forgiven. Family saved. Simple as buying a horse. "There," her mother said, fastening the last button. She turned Leora toward the cracked mirror above the dresser. "You look beautiful." Leora looked like a ghost. The dress hung wrong on her frame, too loose in the shoulders, too tight across the hips. Her dark hair had been pinned up in a style that didn't suit her, and someone had dabbed rouge on her cheeks that only made her look feverish. Her eyes, usually bright hazel, seemed dull. Dead. She looked exactly like what she was, a girl being dressed for slaughter. "I heard he's not a bad man," her mother tried, adjusting a pin that didn't need adjusting. "Martha Kinsley works for him sometimes, cleaning his house. She says he's fair, quiet, but fair. Never raises his voice, never beats his servants?" Leora's laugh came out sharp. "Well, that's something." Her mother flinched. Leora immediately regretted it. None of this was her mother's fault. If anything, her mother had fought against it. She'd heard them arguing late at night, her mother's voice rising in desperate protest while her father's responses grew quieter and quieter, until finally there was just silence. Silence and the date of a wedding nobody wanted. "I'm sorry," Leora whispered. Her mother pulled her into a hug that felt like goodbye. "You're stronger than you know," she said into Leora's hair. "You'll survive this, we all will." Survival. That was the best they could hope for now. The church was packed. Leora hadn't expected that. Hadn't expected half of Copper Ridge to show up on a Thursday morning to watch her humiliation. But there they were. Farmers in their Sunday best, shopkeepers who'd closed early, women in hats they only wore to funerals, all crammed into the pews with expressions that ranged from pity to barely concealed glee. Nothing like a tragedy to break up the monotony of frontier life. Leora walked down the aisle on her father's arm, and the whispers followed her like flies. Poor thing. Heard they were desperate. $3,000, can you imagine? Calder could have had any woman. Wonder why he chose this one. Probably got her cheap. Her father's arm was rigid beneath her hand. He stared straight ahead, jaw clenched so tight she could see the muscle jumping. He looked 10 years older than he had a month ago. At the altar, Rhett Calder was waiting. Leora had only seen him twice before today. Once from a distance, riding through town on a black horse that probably cost more than her family's entire property. Once up close, When he'd come to finalize the arrangement and her father had forced her to sit in the parlor while they discussed terms like she was cattle. He hadn't looked at her much during that meeting, hadn't said much either, just sat in their broken chair, hat in his hands, and nodded while her father laid out the situation with the kind of desperate pride that made Leora want to sink through the floor. When Rhett had finally spoken, it was only to ask one question. And the girl agrees? Her father had said yes before Leora could open her mouth. Now, standing 3 feet away from the man who'd just bought her future, Leora forced herself to look at him properly. He was tall, taller than she'd remembered, broad-shouldered in a black suit that looked expensive but uncomfortable, like he didn't wear such things often. His face was all hard angles, sharp jaw, straight nose, dark brows drawn together in what might have been concentration or irritation. His hair was black, slightly too long, brushing his collar, and his eyes. His eyes were the coldest shade of blue she'd ever seen. They settled on her now, and something flickered across his expression. Surprise, maybe, or disappointment. She couldn't tell. Didn't want to know. The Reverend cleared his throat and began. Leora didn't hear most of it. The words washed over her like water, something about holy matrimony and sacred bonds, until death do us part. Phrases that should have meant something but felt like empty sounds in a language she didn't speak. She was aware of her father releasing her arm and stepping back, of the Reverend's voice droning on, of the weight of the town's stare on her back like physical pressure, of Rhett Calder's hand when he took hers. His palm was rough with calluses, warm despite the October chill seeping through the church walls. His fingers closed around hers carefully, like he was handling something fragile, something that might break. She wanted to pull away, wanted to run, wanted to scream that this was wrong, all of it, that she was a person, not a transaction. "Do you, Leora Catherine Vance, take this man?" She heard herself say, "I do." The words tasted like surrender. Rhett's response came a moment later, his voice low and rough. "I do." And just like that, it was done. The Reverend pronounced them man and wife with all the enthusiasm of someone reading a death certificate. There was no kiss. Rhett didn't lean in, didn't even look like the thought had crossed his mind. He just released her hand and turned toward the exit. The crowd began to disperse. No reception, no celebration. Just a transaction completed, everyone eager to get back to their own lives and gossip about this one. Leora's mother hugged her, whispering something inaudible through tears. Clara clung to her waist, sobbing. Her father shook Rhett's hand and said something that Leora couldn't hear over the roaring in her ears. Then Rhett was leading her outside to a wagon that was nicer than anything her family had ever owned, helping her up onto the bench with a hand under her elbow that was polite but impersonal. He climbed up beside her, took the reins, and clicked his tongue. The horses started moving. Leora watched Copper Ridge shrink behind them, watched her family become small figures in the distance, watched everything she'd ever known disappear around a bend in the road. Neither of them spoke. The silence stretched, filled only with the creak of the wagon and the rhythm of hoofbeats. Leora kept her hands folded in her lap, gripping the borrowed fabric of her borrowed dress, trying to keep her breathing steady. She didn't cry. Wouldn't give him that. They'd been traveling for maybe 20 minutes when Rhett finally broke the silence. "You cold?" His voice startled her. She glanced over to find him staring straight ahead at the road, but there was a blanket folded beside him that he was gesturing toward. "I'm fine," she said. Her voice came out rougher than intended. He nodded once and didn't push, just went back to driving. Another 10 minutes passed. The landscape shifted from scrub grass to better land, greener, more water. This was Calder territory, his kingdom, and now apparently hers too. The thought made her stomach turn. "Listen," Rhett said suddenly. "About all this." Leora's whole body tensed. Here it comes, she thought. The conditions, the expectations, the list of things he'd paid for and now expected in return. But what he said next wasn't anything she'd prepared for. "You don't belong to me." She turned to stare at him. He was still watching the road, jaw set, that same unreadable expression on his face. "What? You don't belong to me," he repeated, quieter this time. "Unless you choose to." Leora blinked, opened her mouth, closed it. Those words didn't make sense, couldn't make sense. He'd just paid $3,000 for her. Her father had sold her to clear a debt. That was the arrangement. That was... "I don't understand," she managed. Rhett was quiet for a moment, hands tight on the reins. Your father came to me, he said finally. Said he was in trouble. Said the bank was going to take everything. He asked if I'd consider an arrangement. Marriage, Leora said flatly. That was his word, not mine. Rhett's mouth twisted. I told him I'd clear the debt. No strings. But he insisted. Said his pride couldn't take charity. Said it had to be this or nothing. Leora's breath caught. So you married me out of pity? I married you because your father gave me an ultimatum, and you were sitting in that parlor looking like you wanted to disappear into the floorboards. His voice was rough. I figured being married to me had to be better than watching your family lose everything. Maybe I was wrong. She didn't know what to say to that. Didn't know what to feel. Anger? Relief? Some confused mixture of both? Your father made it sound like you'd agreed, Rhett continued, like you understood the arrangement and were willing. Willing, Leora repeated. The word came out bitter. I didn't know anything until 3 weeks ago, and I wasn't asked. I was told. Something changed in Rhett's expression. His jaw tightened, and for the first time since they'd met, something like anger flickered across his face, but it wasn't directed at her. Christ, he muttered. They fell back into silence, but it felt different now. Charged. Leora stared at her hands, at the thin gold band that had been slipped onto her finger during the ceremony. It was too big, kept sliding around. Someone else's ring, just like someone else's dress. Nothing about today had actually been hers. There's a room, Rhett said eventually, in the house. It has a lock, on the inside. You'll have your own space, your own life. Far as I'm concerned, this marriage is just papers. You do what you want. Leora turned to look at him again, really look at him, at the hard set of his shoulders, the careful distance he was maintaining between them on the bench, the way he wouldn't quite meet her eyes. He meant it. She could hear it in his voice. But that somehow made it worse. Because if this was just papers, just some act of charity dressed up as matrimony, then what the hell was she supposed to do with it? How was she supposed to live in this man's house, eat his food, exist in his space, knowing she was there because of pity? Knowing she'd been sold, and he'd been the only one decent enough, or stupid enough, to buy? Why? She asked quietly. Rhett glanced at her finally. Why what? Why any of this? You don't know me. You could have just paid the debt, walked away. Why tie yourself to someone else's problem? He looked back at the road, was quiet for so long she didn't think he'd answer. Then, I know what it's like, having everything taken, being powerless to stop it. There was something in his voice that made Leora think there was a story there, something old and unhealed. But before she could ask, the house came into view, and whatever moment they'd been building toward collapsed. Calder Ranch was not what she expected. She'd imagined something grand, a mansion befitting the richest man in the valley. But what appeared before them was more practical than ostentatious. A large 2-story farmhouse, well-built and well-maintained, with a wide porch and shutters that looked freshly painted. There were outbuildings scattered around, a barn, stables, what might have been a bunkhouse for ranch hands. It was nice. Nicer than anywhere she'd ever lived, but it wasn't a palace. It was just a home. Rhett brought the wagon to a stop in front of the porch and climbed down. Walked around to her side and offered his hand. Leora took it because she had to. Let him help her down because the dress was too long and she would have tripped otherwise. A woman appeared in the doorway, middle-aged, sturdy-looking, with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun. Martha Kinsley, Leora realized, the housekeeper her mother had mentioned. Mr. Calder, Martha said with a nod, then gentler. Mrs. Calder. The name hit Leora like a slap. Mrs. Calder. That was her now. She'd stopped being a Vance the moment the Reverend said those final words. Martha, Rhett said, this is Leora. She'll need to get settled. Can you show her to the east bedroom? Of course. Martha's expression was kind, knowing, like maybe she understood more than Leora wanted her to. Rhett turned to Leora. I'll bring your things in. Martha can help you with whatever you need. Then he was gone, striding back toward the wagon, leaving Leora standing on a porch that wasn't hers, in front of a house that wasn't hers, wearing a name that didn't fit any better than the dress. Come on, dear. Martha said gently. "Let's get you out of the cold." The house was warm inside, clean, smelled like bread and wood smoke. Martha led her up a staircase with a polished banister and down a hallway with paintings Leora didn't recognize. "This'll be your room," Martha said, opening a door at the end of the hall. "Mr. Calder had it prepared when he knew you'd be coming." The room was bigger than the entire bedroom Leora had shared with Clara. A four-poster bed dominated one wall, already made up with a quilt that looked handmade. There was a dresser, a wardrobe, a small desk by the window, curtains in a soft blue, a rug that her bare feet would have sunk into if she'd taken off her shoes, and on the inside of the door, exactly as Rhett had promised, a lock. "Bathroom's just across the hall," Martha was saying. "You'll share it with Mr. Calder, but he's not home much. Spends most of his time working the land or in his study. You probably won't see him unless you want to." Unless you want to. There was that phrase again, choice, agency. Things Leora had just spent the last 3 weeks believing she'd lost forever. "Thank you," Leora managed. Martha smiled. "I'll leave you to get settled. Come down when you're ready. I've got supper on, and you look like you could use a decent meal." Then she was gone, closing the door softly behind her. Leora stood in the center of the room and felt everything she'd been holding back since morning crash over her. This was her life now, this room, this house, this man she didn't know and hadn't chosen. Her family was miles away, probably sitting down to dinner in a kitchen that would feel too empty without her. Clara would take over her chores. Her mother would move her things out of their shared space. Her father would sleep easier, knowing the debt was cleared. And Leora would be here, in this beautiful room with its locked door and empty promises. She sank down onto the bed and finally let herself cry. The first week passed in a strange, suspended silence. Leora barely saw Rhett. He left early each morning before she woke, and when he returned in the evenings, he took his meals in his study. Martha brought trays to both of them, Leora in the dining room, Rhett behind his closed door, like they were strangers sharing a boarding house rather than husband and wife under the same roof. It should have been a relief. This was exactly what he'd promised: separate lives, no obligations, freedom. But freedom felt a lot like loneliness when you had no idea what to do with it. Leora spent those first days learning the house. Martha showed her the kitchen, the parlor, the library that Rhett apparently never used, showed her where things were kept, how things were done, treated her like a guest, which was somehow worse than being treated like help. "You're the mistress of the house now," Martha said when Leora tried to help with dishes. "You don't need to—" "I need to do something," Leora interrupted. "Please." So Martha let her help, taught her how Rhett liked his coffee, black, strong enough to strip paint, where he kept his good bourbon, top shelf in the study, though he rarely touched it, which of the ranch hands could be trusted, and which needed watching. It was in these small conversations that Leora began to piece together the man she'd married. Rhett Calder had owned this land for 5 years. Before that, he'd been nobody. A drifter, some said. Others whispered about family back east, money that came from somewhere dark. The only thing everyone agreed on was that he'd arrived in Copper Ridge with enough cash to buy half the valley and the kind of silence that made people stop asking questions. He was fair to his workers, paid well, didn't tolerate theft or cruelty, but he kept to himself, rarely came to town, and turned down every dinner invitation and social gathering he received. "He's lonely," Martha said one afternoon, rolling out pie dough with practiced efficiency. "Won't admit it, but he is. This house is too big for one person, always has been." Leora thought about the locked door between their rooms, about the careful distance Rhett maintained whenever they passed in the hallway, about the way he'd said, "unless you choose to," like he was giving her a gift instead of just refusing to claim what he'd paid for. "He doesn't seem lonely," she said. "He seems contained." Martha's hands stilled. "That's one word for it. What's another?" "Careful," Martha resumed rolling. "Mr. Calder's a man who's learned to keep things close, trust slow. After what happened to—" She stopped abruptly, like she'd said too much. "After what?" Leora pressed. But Martha just shook her head. "Not my story to tell, dear. If he wants you to know, he'll say." That night, Leora saw Rhett for the first time since the wedding. She'd been in the library, unable to sleep, when she heard the front door open and close. Heavy footsteps in the hall. She froze, book in hand, not sure if she should announce herself or stay hidden. The footsteps stopped outside the library door. There was a long pause. Then Rhett's voice, rough with exhaustion. "You're up late." "Couldn't sleep," Leora said, setting the book down. "I can leave if you—" "No." He appeared in the doorway, still in his work clothes, dirt on his boots and dust in his hair. He looked tired. "Stay. I just needed— I forgot something." He crossed to the desk, rifled through a drawer, pulled out a folder. The whole time, Leora watched him, tried to reconcile this man, who moved through the house like he was afraid of taking up too much space, with the one who owned half the valley. "Martha says you've been helping in the kitchen," Rhett said without looking up. "I needed something to do." "You don't have to work. You can—" "I know what I can do," Leora interrupted. "You've made it very clear I can do whatever I want, but sitting in that room all day doing nothing is driving me insane." Rhett's hands stilled on the folder. Finally, he looked at her, really looked at her. "What do you want to do?" The question caught her off guard. What did she want? Nobody had asked her that in maybe ever. "I don't know," she admitted. "Back home I helped with the farm, tended the animals, fixed fences. I'm not good at just existing." Something shifted in Rhett's expression. "You know how to ride?" "A little. We had horses before the drought, before everything fell apart." "I could use help checking the fence lines in the north pasture," he said slowly. "If you're interested, it's not glamorous work, long days, hard riding, but it's something." Leora's heart jumped. "I'd like that." Rhett nodded once. "Tomorrow then. Dawn." He left, taking his folder and leaving behind a silence that felt different, less empty, more like possibility. Leora went to bed that night and slept better than she had all week. Dawn came cold and clear. Leora dressed in the most practical clothes she owned, which weren't saying much given she'd come with almost nothing. But Martha had quietly left a pair of worn trousers and a flannel shirt on her bed the night before, along with boots that looked suspiciously like they'd fit. When Leora came downstairs, Rhett was already waiting. He handed her a cup of coffee without a word, and they drank in comfortable silence as the sun began its slow climb. "Ever worked cattle?" he asked as they walked toward the stables. "A little. We only had a few head, but I helped my father with branding and sorting." "Good enough." He stopped in front of a stall where a gray mare was waiting. "This is Dancer. She's gentle. Good for learning on." The mare nuzzled Leora's palm, and something tight in her chest loosened. She'd missed this. Missed animals, work, purpose. They rode out as the world turned from gray to gold. Rhett set an easy pace, pointing out landmarks and explaining the layout of his land. It was vast, thousands of acres stretching toward mountains she couldn't even see the end of. "This was all wilderness when I got here," he said at one point, gesturing at a stretch of grassland dotted with cattle. "No fences, no order. Just land nobody wanted because it was too hard to work." "So you made it work," Leora said. "Didn't have much choice." His mouth quirked. "Turns out I'm stubborn." It was the closest thing to a joke she'd heard from him. Leora smiled despite herself. They spent the day riding the fence line, checking posts, replacing broken wire. It was hard work, exactly what Rhett had promised. By midday, Leora's hands were blistered and her legs ached from unfamiliar hours in the saddle. But she felt alive. Somewhere around afternoon, they stopped to rest and water the horses. Rhett pulled out a canteen and a package wrapped in cloth that turned out to be sandwiches Martha had packed. They ate sitting on a fallen log, watching the cattle graze in the distance. "Thank you," Leora said quietly. "For this." Rhett looked over at her, sandwich halfway to his mouth. "For what?" "For not treating me like I'm made of glass. For letting me—" She struggled for the right words. "For giving me something to do besides sit in that house and wonder what my life is supposed to be now." He was quiet for a moment, then, "You're not the only one who doesn't know how to just exist." There it was again, that hint of something beneath the surface, some story he wasn't telling. "Martha said you've been here 5 years, Leora ventured. "About that." "Where were you before?" Rhett's jaw tightened. Somewhere else. It was clearly a door closing, but Leora had spent enough time around stubborn men to recognize when pushing would only make things worse. Well, she said instead, I'm glad you ended up here. He looked at her sharply, like he was trying to figure out if she was being sarcastic. She met his gaze steadily, and something in his expression softened. Yeah, he said quietly. Me too. They rode back as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that made the land look like it was on fire. Leora's whole body hurt, but it was the good kind of hurt, the kind that came from actual work, actual purpose. When they reached the stables, Rhett helped her down from Dancer, his hands careful on her waist, releasing her the moment her feet touched ground. Same time tomorrow? He asked. I'll be there. He nodded, then hesitated. You did good today. Better than most hands I've hired. The compliment caught her off guard. Thank you. Don't thank me. You earned it. He walked away to tend to his horse, and Leora stood there feeling something she hadn't felt in weeks. Hope. Maybe this didn't have to be a prison. Maybe, somehow, she could make something of this strange half-marriage, this careful distance, this man who kept his walls so high but sometimes let her peek over them. Maybe she could build a life here. Not the life she'd imagined. Not the life she'd choose if she could go back and rewrite everything. But a life nonetheless. Over the next 3 weeks, a routine developed. Mornings, Leora rode out with Rhett to check fences, move cattle, mend whatever needed mending. The work was hard but satisfying. She learned how to rope, how to read the weather in the mountains, how to tell when a cow was about to calve just by the way it held its weight. Rhett was a good teacher, patient, thorough, never condescending. He treated her like a capable partner rather than a burden he'd taken on. And slowly, in the spaces between work, they began to talk. Not about big things, not about feelings or the strangeness of their arrangement, but about small things. The books in his library, the best way to cure jerky, whether the winter would come early this year. Afternoons, Leora helped Martha in the house or worked in the garden she'd started behind the kitchen. Evenings, she and Rhett began taking their meals together, quiet dinners where conversation came easier than it had at first. You're settling in, Martha observed one day as they shelled peas on the porch. I suppose I am, Leora admitted. Mr. Calder seems lighter too. Haven't seen him smile this much in, well, ever, actually. Leora thought about that, about the way Rhett's face had started to relax around her, the way he'd laughed, actually laughed, when she'd fallen in the creek chasing a stubborn calf last week. It's not what I expected, she said quietly. Marriage rarely is. Martha's hands moved steadily. But it's not always the fairy tale we hope for. Sometimes it's just partnership. Two people figuring out how to share space without driving each other mad. Is that what this is? Martha smiled. Seems like it might be heading that way. That night, after dinner, Rhett surprised her by asking if she'd like to see the rest of the ranch. There's a spot up on the ridge, he said. Good view of the valley, if you're not too tired. She wasn't tired, or rather she was, but the thought of spending more time outside this house, outside herself, was too appealing to pass up. They rode out in the dusk, their horses' hooves quiet on the soft earth. The ridge wasn't far, maybe 20 minutes, but the climb was steep enough that Leora had to focus on Dancer's footing. When they reached the top, the view stole her breath. The whole valley spread below them like a painting. She could see Copper Ridge in the distance, lights beginning to flicker on as darkness fell. Could see the ribbon of the creek, the patchwork of farms, the dark line of mountains beyond. This is beautiful, she breathed. I come here when I need to think, Rhett said. He'd dismounted and was standing at the edge, hands in his pockets, staring out at the view. Reminds me why I fought so hard for this place. Leora slid down from Dancer and joined him. Tell me, she said impulsively. Tell me how you got here. Who you were before. She expected him to shut down, to give her that look that said the door was closed, but instead, after a long silence, he started talking. I had a family once, he said quietly, back in Missouri. My father had a farm. Not big, but it was ours. Paid for. Safe. He paused. Or so we thought. Leora waited, not daring to breathe. Bank foreclosed when I was 17. Said my father had missed payments. He hadn't. But the bank manager wanted the land, had his eye on it for development, made up the debt, forged documents. By the time we realized what was happening, it was too late. What did you do? Fought, tried to get a lawyer, prove it was fraud. But we were nobody. Farmers. They were men with money and power. Guess who won? His voice was flat, but Leora could hear the old anger underneath, the kind that had hardened into scar tissue. My mother died that winter, pneumonia. But really, it was heartbreak. My father... Rhett's hands tightened into fists. He held on for another year, tried to start over, couldn't. One morning I woke up and found him in the barn. Leora's hand moved before she could think, settling on his arm. I'm sorry. I was 18, had nothing, no family, no home, no prospects. He looked down at her hand on his arm but didn't pull away. So I left. Drifted for a while. Did work I'm not proud of. Saved every penny, and when I had enough, I came here and bought land that nobody else wanted, built something that nobody could take from me. And you've been here ever since. And I've been here ever since. He finally looked at her. That's why I paid your father's debt. Because I know what it's like to lose everything because of money you don't have. I wouldn't wish that on anyone. Understanding clicked into place. That's why you gave me the choice. Because it was taken from you. Everyone deserves a choice, he said simply. They stood there as darkness fell completely, the stars beginning to emerge overhead. Leora didn't move her hand, and Rhett didn't ask her to. I'm starting to understand you, she said quietly. Yeah? You're not cold, you're just careful. Rhett made a sound that might have been a laugh. Careful, that's one word for it. What's another? He looked at her, and in the starlight, his eyes didn't seem cold at all. Scared, he admitted, of messing this up, of making you feel like you owe me something, of being the thing that traps you. You're not, Leora said, and she meant it. You're the first person in my life who's ever asked what I wanted. Something passed between them, something that made the air feel different, charged. Rhett cleared his throat and stepped back, breaking the moment. We should head back, it's getting cold. They rode home in silence, but it was the comfortable kind, the kind that didn't need filling. And when they parted in the hallway outside their separate rooms, Leora found herself reluctant to go inside. Found herself wanting to stay in that in-between space just a little longer. Thank you, she said, for telling me. Thank you for listening. She watched him disappear into his room, heard the quiet click of the door closing. Then she went into hers and lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about scars and choices and the strange way that broken things sometimes found each other. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. Winter was coming. And Leora called her, she was finally starting to get used to that name, was beginning to realize that she wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living. The first snow came on a Tuesday morning in early November, soft and silent, blanketing the valley in white that made everything look clean and new. Leora woke to the unfamiliar brightness filtering through her curtains, and for a moment, just a breath, forgot where she was. Then reality settled back in, familiar now instead of frightening, and she rose to face another day at Calder Ranch. She'd been married for 6 weeks. It felt both longer and shorter than that. Longer because her old life, the cramped farmhouse, Clara's snoring, her mother's worried face across the breakfast table, already seemed like something from another lifetime. Shorter because she still woke sometimes expecting to find herself back in her narrow bed, the whole thing just a nightmare her mind had conjured. But the weight of the ring on her finger was real. The locked door between her room and Rhett's was real. And the strange, careful friendship they'd built over morning coffee and fence repairs and quiet dinners was perhaps the most real thing of all. Leora dressed quickly in the warm clothes Martha had helped her acquire. Proper ranch wear now, not borrowed pieces that didn't fit. She'd learned to braid her hair tight to keep it out of her face during work, had calluses on her palms that matched Rhett's, had muscles in her arms and shoulders that she'd never had before. She looked different, felt different. Whether that was good or bad, she still couldn't quite decide. Downstairs, Rhett was already at the kitchen table, nursing his coffee and staring out the window at the falling snow. He looked up when she entered, and something that might have been a smile crossed his face. Morning, he said. Guess we're not checking fences today. Too much snow? Snow's fine. It's what's coming after, that's the problem. He gestured at the sky, which had that heavy gray quality that promised more weather. Storms moving in. Could last a few days. We'll need to get the cattle moved to the lower pastures before it hits hard. Leora poured herself coffee and joined him at the table. This had become their routine, planning the day's work over that first cup, when the world was still quiet and the demands hadn't yet begun piling up. How many head? She asked. About 200 in the North Range. We've got maybe 6 hours before the weather turns bad. He looked at her with that expression he got when he was trying to decide if she could handle something. It's going to be hard riding, cold, long hours. I can do it. I know you can. And the way he said it, simple and sure, made warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the coffee. They rode out an hour later with 4 of Rhett's ranch hands, men who'd nodded at Leora with varying degrees of acceptance over the past weeks. Some of them had warmed to her presence. Others still looked at her like she was playing dress-up, a town girl trying to be something she wasn't. She didn't care. She was here to work, not to win popularity contests. The North Range was beautiful under its coating of snow, but Leora could already feel the temperature dropping. The wind had teeth now, biting through her layers. The cattle were scattered across several miles, and it took time to gather them, to push them toward the lower ground where they'd have better shelter from what was coming. Leora worked alongside the men, her horse moving easily beneath her now that she'd gotten used to Dancer's rhythms. She'd learned to anticipate the cattle's movements, to position herself where she'd be most useful. Rhett caught her eye once across the milling herd and gave her a small nod that felt like praise. By midday, the snow was falling harder. By mid-afternoon, it was coming down in sheets that made it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. The wind had picked up too, howling across the open ground like something alive and angry. "We need to move faster," Rhett shouted over the wind. "This is getting bad." They pushed harder, driving the cattle faster than was probably smart, but the alternative was getting caught out in a blizzard with 200 head of confused, frightened animals. Leora's hands were numb inside her gloves. Her face felt frozen, but she kept going, kept pushing, kept doing her part. They made it to the lower pasture just as visibility dropped to almost nothing. The cattle milled in the sheltered valley, safer now, but still restless. Rhett dismounted and came over to Leora, his face red from cold, ice forming in his dark hair. "You all right?" he asked, having to lean close to be heard over the wind. "I'm fine," she said, and meant it, even though she couldn't feel her toes anymore. "Good." His hand touched her shoulder briefly. "Good work today. Let's get back before we freeze solid out here." The ride back to the ranch was brutal. The snow was blinding, the wind relentless. Leora couldn't see Rhett ahead of her, could only trust that Dancer knew the way home. Her whole body was shaking by the time the dark shape of the house appeared through the white. They stumbled into the barn, and the sudden absence of wind felt like stepping into a warm room, even though the temperature hadn't changed. Rhett helped her down from Dancer, her legs nearly gave out when she tried to stand, and steadied her with hands on her arms. "Christ, you're shaking like a leaf," he muttered. "Get inside, I'll handle the horses." "I can help." "Inside, Leora, that's not a request." She was too cold to argue. Martha met her at the door with blankets and hot tea and a stream of worried chatter about foolish men who kept their wives out in weather like this. Leora let herself be bundled into a chair by the fire, let Martha fuss over her, and slowly feeling began to return to her extremities, along with a burning ache that made her want to cry. Rhett came in 20 minutes later, looking only slightly better than she felt. Martha immediately started in on him too, but he waved her off. "We're fine, Martha. Just cold. Nothing that won't fix itself." "You could have gotten yourselves killed," Martha scolded. 200 cattle aren't worth—" "Those 200 cattle are how we eat through winter," Rhett interrupted, but not unkindly. "We did what we had to do, and we're back now, safe." He looked at Leora across the room, and something passed between them, understanding, maybe, or just the shared knowledge of what they'd accomplished together. The storm lasted 3 days. 3 days of being trapped inside while the wind howled and the snow piled up against the windows. 3 days of Leora discovering that living in close quarters with Rhett Calder was entirely different from working alongside him on the range. The first day was fine. They kept to their separate spaces. Rhett in his study, Leora in the library, or helping Martha in the kitchen. They came together for meals and then retreated again, like dancers following familiar steps. The second day, the walls started to feel closer. Leora found herself restless, pacing the halls, picking up books, and putting them down unread. She'd never been good at sitting still. The forced inactivity made her skin itch. She ended up in the library again late that afternoon, staring out at the endless white, when Red appeared in the doorway. "You look like you're plotting an escape," he said. She turned. He was leaning against the frame, arms crossed, that almost smile on his face that she'd learned meant he was amused. "If I had somewhere to go, I might," she admitted. "I'm not used to being cooped up like this." "Me neither." He straightened. "Want to do something about it?" "Like what?" "Come on." He led her upstairs to a room she'd never been in, at the far end of the hall from their bedrooms. When he opened the door, Leora saw it was full of furniture covered in dust sheets, boxes stacked against the walls, the accumulated debris of years. "What is this?" she asked. "Storage. Stuff I've never gotten around to dealing with." He pulled the sheet off a dresser, sending up a cloud of dust. "Figured we could sort through it, see if there's anything worth keeping, give us something to do besides stare at walls." It was such a practical, unglamorous suggestion that Leora almost laughed. But the alternative was another afternoon of restless boredom, so she agreed. They spent the next few hours going through boxes, old papers, broken tools, things that Rhett had apparently just thrown up here when he didn't know what else to do with them. Most of it was junk, but occasionally they'd find something interesting. A set of leather-bound books, a music box that still played when Rhett wound it, a photograph of people neither of them recognized. "Who are they?" Leora asked, studying the faded image. Rhett glanced over. "No idea. This stuff came with the house. Previous owner left a lot behind." "Why?" "Died intestate, no heirs. Bank sold it to me with everything still inside." He pulled another box toward him. "I always meant to go through it properly, but never got around to it." They worked in companionable silence for a while. Then Leora's hand closed on something small and round at the bottom of a crate. She pulled it out, a compass, old but beautiful. The brass tarnished, but the glass still intact. "Look at this," she said, holding it up. Rhett took it carefully, turning it over in his hands. "My father had one like this. Used it when we'd go hunting." His voice went soft. "I wonder if it still works." He held it flat in his palm. The needle swung, settled, pointed north. "Still works," Leora said. "Yeah." He stared at it for a moment longer, then held it out to her. "You should keep it." "What? No, I—" "Keep it," he insisted. "Something to help you find your way if you ever need to." The words hung between them, weighted with meaning that Leora wasn't sure how to parse. She took the compass, their fingers brushing as it changed hands, and slipped it into her pocket. "Thank you," she said quietly. He just nodded and went back to sorting, but something had shifted. Some invisible line had been crossed. That night at dinner, for the first time, the silence felt awkward. Leora couldn't stop thinking about the compass in her pocket, about the way Rhett had looked when he'd mentioned his father, about the growing sense that they were circling something neither of them wanted to name. "I should probably go to town soon," she said abruptly, just to break the quiet. "Once the storm clears, I haven't seen my family since the wedding, since she'd watched Copper Ridge disappear behind them and hadn't looked back." Rhett set down his fork. "You want to visit them?" "I don't know." She pushed food around her plate. "I should, probably. Clara's probably wondering if I'm even alive." "You could write her. I can have one of the hands take a letter when the weather clears. It's not the same as seeing her." "No," Rhett agreed. "It's not." Another silence. Then, "You could come with me, if you wanted. To town." She hadn't meant to say it. The words just slipped out. Rhett looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. "You want me there?" "I don't want to go alone," Leora admitted. "Facing them by myself, answering questions about this, about us. I just thought it might be easier if I was there to prove you're not being held prisoner." Something like that. He considered this. "All right. When the road's clear, we'll go together." The relief that washed through her was probably out of proportion to the situation, but Leora didn't care. "Thank you." "Nothing to thank me for." He picked up his fork again. "They're your family. You should see them." But the way he said it made Leora wonder if he was thinking about his own family, the ones he'd lost, the graves he'd probably never visited because going back meant facing everything that had been taken from him. The storm broke on the fourth day, revealing a world transformed. The snow was deep enough to bury the fence posts in the lower fields. The sun came out, painfully bright against all that white, and the temperature climbed just enough to make the work of digging out possible. It took 2 more days before the road to town was passable. When Rhett said they could make the trip, Leora's stomach immediately tied itself in knots. She dressed carefully that morning, aware that this would be the first time anyone in Copper Ridge had seen her since the wedding. They'd judge how she looked, what she wore, whether she seemed happy or broken. Every detail would be ammunition for their gossip. She chose a dress Martha had helped her make. Simple blue cotton, well-fitted, practical but pretty. Pulled her hair back in a neat bun. Looked at herself in the mirror and tried to see what they would see. Mrs. Rhett Calder, the girl who'd been sold to save her family. When she came downstairs, Rhett was waiting by the wagon. He'd dressed up too, clean shirt, vest, his good coat. He looked uncomfortable, like he always did in anything other than work clothes. "Ready?" he asked. No, she thought, but said, "As I'll ever be." The ride to town was quiet. Leora watched the familiar landscape pass by, everything covered in snow that made it look almost magical. Almost. Copper Ridge appeared in the distance, and Leora's heart started beating faster. "We don't have to do this," Rhett said, glancing at her. "If you're not ready, we can turn around." "I'm ready," she lied. They drove down the main street, and Leora felt the weight of every stare. People stopped what they were doing to watch them pass. Whispers followed in their wake like leaves blown by wind. Rhett kept his eyes forward, jaw set, but his hands were tight on the reins. They stopped in front of the general store. Rhett helped her down, and Leora was grateful for the steadying hand because her legs felt shaky. "I need to get some supplies," he said. "Meet you back here in an hour?" It was a kindness, giving her time alone with her family. "Thank you." He nodded and headed into the store, leaving Leora standing on the wooden sidewalk feeling exposed and uncertain. She made herself walk toward her family's small house on the edge of town, made herself knock on the door that she'd walked through 1,000 times without thinking. Her mother answered. For a moment they just stared at each other. Then her mother pulled her inside and into a hug so tight Leora couldn't breathe. "Oh, thank heavens," her mother whispered. "Thank heavens you're all right." "I'm fine, Mama," Leora managed. "I'm fine." Clara appeared from the kitchen and launched herself at Leora with a cry of joy. Her father stood in the doorway to the parlor, looking older and somehow smaller than she remembered. "Leora," he said. Just her name, nothing else. They sat in the parlor, the same room where Rhett had come to make his arrangement, where her life had been negotiated without her consent. It felt strange to be back here, like visiting a museum of her old life. Her mother fussed over her, asking 100 questions. Was she eating enough? Was the house warm? Did she have everything she needed? Leora answered patiently, aware that her mother was really asking a different question. Are you happy? Are you safe? Did we do the right thing? "He treats you well?" her father asked finally, his voice gruff. "Yes," Leora said, and realized it was true. "He's kind. Fair. He doesn't—" She struggled for how to explain their arrangement without making it sound stranger than it already was. "We have an understanding." "What kind of understanding?" Clara asked, eyes wide. "The kind where we're figuring out how to live together without making each other miserable," Leora said lightly, trying to make it sound normal. Her mother looked like she wanted to press further, but her father cleared his throat. "The debt's cleared," he said. "Bank confirmed it. We're keeping the farm." "I'm glad," Leora said, and meant it. Even if the cost had been her, at least something good had come from this mess. They talked for a while longer, but it felt forced, like none of them knew how to bridge the gap that had opened up. Leora wasn't their daughter anymore. Not really. She was Mrs. Calder now, someone who belonged somewhere else, to someone else. When she finally stood to leave, Clara grabbed her hand. "Will you come back? Visit more?" "I'll try," Leora promised. "When I can." She hugged them all, felt her mother's tears on her neck, and then she was walking back toward town with something heavy and sad sitting in her chest. Rhett was loading supplies into the wagon when she arrived. He took one look at her face and didn't ask questions, just helped her up onto the seat and climbed beside her. They were almost out of town when a voice called out, "Mrs. Calder!" Leora turned to see Margaret Whitaker, the banker's wife, a woman who'd always looked at Leora's family with barely concealed disdain, hurrying toward them with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mrs. Calder, How lovely to see you, Margaret said, all false sweetness. We've been simply dying to know how you're settling in at the ranch. Fine, thank you, Leora said carefully. I'm sure it must be quite an adjustment, going from such humble circumstances to being mistress of the largest ranch in the valley. The emphasis on humble was deliberate. You must feel like Cinderella. Leora felt Rhett tense beside her. His hand moved to her knee in what she realized was a gesture of support, or warning. She couldn't tell which. I feel like myself, Leora said evenly, just in a different place. How charming. Margaret's smile sharpened. Well, we're having a gathering at the church next Sunday, after services. All the ladies of the town. You should come. It would be a perfect opportunity for you to integrate yourself into society. As Mrs. Calder, you have certain social obligations now. It wasn't an invitation. It was a summons, a test. Leora opened her mouth, unsure what to say, but Rhett spoke first. We'll consider it, he said flatly. Now, if you'll excuse us, we need to get back before dark. He clicked to the horses without waiting for Margaret's response. They pulled away, leaving her standing in the street looking affronted. They were silent for several miles. Then Rhett said, You don't have to go. To the church thing? To any of it. Those women, he shook his head. They'll eat you alive, find every weakness and exploit it. It's what they do. You sound like you speak from experience. I've lived here 5 years, trust me, I've seen how they operate. He glanced at her. You want my advice? Stay away. Let them gossip. Eventually they'll get bored and find someone else to torment. It was probably good advice. Safe advice. But something in Leora bristled at the idea of hiding, of letting those women think they'd won simply by existing in their superior little circles. What if I want to go? She asked. Rhett looked at her like she'd suggested jumping off a cliff. Why would you want that? Because if I don't, it'll just prove what they already think, that I'm ashamed, that I'm some pathetic thing you took pity on. She met his eyes. I'm not ashamed, and I won't act like I am. Something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe, or respect. It'll be bad, he warned. They won't be kind. I can handle unkind. Can you? The question hung between them. Could she? Leora didn't know. But she was tired of feeling like a victim, tired of being treated like damaged goods. Maybe facing those women would be terrible, but at least it would be her choice to do it. I want to try, she said finally. Rhett studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. All right, but I'm coming with you. You? You think I'm letting you walk into that viper pit alone? His mouth quirked. Besides, it'll be funny watching Margaret Whittaker try to be civil to me after I've been dodging her dinner invitations for 5 years. Despite everything, Leora felt herself smile. You're sure? I'm sure. He looked back at the road. We're in this together, right? That was the deal. It hadn't been the deal. The deal had been separate lives, no obligations, freedom. But somewhere along the way, without either of them quite noticing, the deal had changed. They rode the rest of the way home in comfortable silence, and when Rhett helped her down from the wagon, his hands lingered just a moment longer than necessary on her waist. Thank you, Leora said quietly. For today. For all of it. Nothing to thank me for, he said, but his eyes said something different. The week leading up to Sunday dragged by with the weight of impending doom. Leora tried to focus on normal things, work around the ranch, helping Martha, anything to keep her mind occupied. But anxiety crept in during quiet moments, whispering all the ways this could go wrong. Martha noticed, of course. The woman saw everything. You're wound tighter than a spring, she observed on Saturday afternoon while they were preparing bread dough. It's just a church gathering, dear, not an execution. Feels like the same thing, Leora muttered. Martha's hand stilled in the dough. You know you don't have to prove anything to those women. Most of them have never worked a day in their lives. They sit around drinking tea and pretending they're better than everyone else because their husbands have money. But they do have something I don't, Leora said. Legitimacy. They married for love, or at least for normal reasons. Not because their families were desperate. Half of them married for money or status, Martha said bluntly. Don't let them fool you with their romantic notions. Margaret Whittaker married the bank manager because he was the richest unmarried man in town, and everybody knows it. Catherine Morrison's husband is 20 years older than her, and she cried through the whole ceremony. Sarah Chen married to escape her parents' house. Martha started kneading again, forcefully. Your circumstances might be unusual, but you're not alone in marrying for practical reasons. You're just more honest about it. Imuls ommata masfan. It was a kind thought, but Leora wasn't sure it made her feel better. Honesty was all well and good until it became ammunition for people who wanted to hurt you. That night, she lay in bed unable to sleep, staring at the ceiling and trying to prepare herself for whatever tomorrow would bring. She heard Rhett moving around in his room. He was having trouble sleeping too, apparently. On impulse, Leora got up and knocked softly on the connecting door between their rooms. It was a door neither of them had ever used, a barrier they'd both respected. The movement on the other side stopped. Then, "Come in." She opened the door. Rhett was sitting on the edge of his bed, still fully dressed, a book in his hands that he clearly hadn't been reading. He looked as tired as she felt. "Can't sleep?" he asked. "No." Leora hovered in the doorway, suddenly uncertain about this impulse. I don't know. Needed to talk, I guess." He set the book aside and gestured to the chair by his window. "Sit." She did, tucking her feet up under her nightgown, suddenly aware of how intimate this was. Being in his bedroom in the middle of the night, both of them in their nightclothes, just talking. "Having second thoughts about tomorrow?" he asked. "About 100 of them." She pulled the blanket she'd brought tighter around her shoulders. "What if they're right? What if I don't belong in their world? What if I make everything worse by trying?" Rhett leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Here's what I know about you, Leora Vance." Leora called her. "You rode out in a blizzard to move cattle when most men would have turned back. You work harder than half my ranch hands. You took a bad situation and made something decent out of it." He met her eyes. "You belong anywhere you decide you want to belong. And anyone who says different can go to hell." The conviction in his voice startled her, made her believe, just for a moment, that maybe he was right. "When did you get so good at pep talks?" she asked, trying to lighten the mood. "I'm not. I just hate watching people underestimate you." He stood, crossed to a cabinet, and pulled out a bottle and 2 glasses. "Drink?" "It's the middle of the night, exactly when drinking makes the most sense." He poured 2 fingers of amber liquid into each glass and handed her one. "To tomorrow. May it be less terrible than we're imagining." Leora raised her glass. "That's a low bar." "I'm a practical man." They drank. The whiskey burned going down, but it warmed her from the inside out. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, passing the bottle back and forth, and Leora felt the knot of anxiety in her chest start to loosen. "Can I ask you something?" she said eventually. "Depends on the question." "Why do you hate going to town so much? I know you avoid it, but why?" Rhett refilled his glass, taking his time with the answer. "Because every time I go, I'm reminded that I'm an outsider. That they all have theories about where I came from, who I am, what I'm hiding, and the truth is..." He paused. "The truth is, I like being unknown. I like that they can't define me or put me in a box. Going to their gatherings, playing their social games, it feels like giving them permission to pick me apart. But you're going tomorrow, for me." "Yeah," he said simply, "for you." The weight of that settled between them. Leora wanted to say something profound, something that would convey how much his support meant, but the words wouldn't come. So she just said, "Thank you." "Stop thanking me," Rhett said, but there was no heat in it. "We're partners, remember? Partners show up for each other." Partners. The word echoed in Leora's mind as she eventually made her way back to her own room, as she finally fell into an uneasy sleep. They were partners. When had that happened? When had this arrangement of convenience become something more solid, more real? She didn't have an answer, but as she drifted off, she realized she didn't mind not knowing. Sunday arrived too quickly. Leora dressed in her best dress, the one Martha had helped her make, navy blue with small white buttons, respectable and modest. She pulled her hair into a neat bun, put on the pearl earrings that had been her grandmother's, and studied herself in the mirror. She looked like someone's wife, someone who belonged. The illusion would have to be enough. Rhett was waiting downstairs, and when he saw her, something flickered in his expression that might have been approval. Or maybe just relief that she wasn't backing out. "Ready?" he asked. "No, but let's go anyway." The church was full when they arrived. Leora felt every eye turn toward them as they entered, felt the weight of judgment and curiosity pressing down like physical force. Rhett's hand found the small of her back, a gesture of support that helped ground her. They sat near the back. The service passed in a blur of hymns and sermons that Leora didn't hear. She was too busy being aware of the whispers behind hands, the sidelong glances, the way Margaret Whittaker kept turning around to stare at her with that calculating smile. When it was over, the women gathered in the church hall for their meeting. Leora wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at her to leave, to escape before things got worse. But Rhett squeezed her hand once, quick and reassuring, before she had to go in, and somehow that was enough to keep her moving forward. The hall was set up with chairs in a circle, a table with tea and pastries in the corner. About 15 women were there, ranging from Margaret Whittaker and her wealthy friends to younger wives who looked as uncertain as Leora felt. "Mrs. Calder!" Margaret called out, saccharine sweet. "How wonderful that you could join us. Please, sit here." She gestured to an empty chair that was naturally directly across from her own, the spider inviting the fly into her web. Leora sat, accepted the teacup someone handed her, tried to look calm while her heart hammered against her ribs. The meeting started with mundane business, planning a fundraiser, discussing the church roof repairs. Leora stayed quiet, just listening, trying to get a feel for the dynamics. Margaret clearly ran things, with a few lieutenants who agreed with everything she said. The younger women mostly stayed silent. Then, about 20 minutes in, Margaret turned her attention directly to Leora. "So, Mrs. Calder," she said, and the room went quiet. "Tell us about your new life. It must be such a change from what you're accustomed to." There it was, the first cut, disguised as friendly interest. "It is different," Leora said carefully, "but good. The ranch keeps me busy." "I'm sure it does, though I must say I was surprised to hear you're doing actual ranch work. Most women in your position would hire help for such things." "I like the work," Leora said. "It's satisfying." Margaret's smile didn't waver. "How admirable. Though one does wonder if it's quite appropriate. You're Mrs. Rhett Calder now. There are certain standards, certain expectations. I meet them by being useful," Leora interrupted, surprising herself, "by contributing instead of just existing." A few of the younger women looked impressed. Margaret's smile tightened. Of course. I simply meant that you have an image to maintain now. The Calder name carries weight in this valley. People will judge your husband based on how you present yourself." And there was the real message. "You're dragging him down. You're not good enough." Leora felt her temper start to rise, but she kept her voice level. "I think my husband is capable of maintaining his own image, and I think anyone who would judge him based on who he married probably isn't worth impressing." The room was dead silent now. A few women looked shocked. One, a younger wife named Emma, was trying not to smile. Margaret set down her teacup with a delicate clink. "How very bold of you." "But then again, I suppose we shouldn't be surprised. Your entire situation is rather bold, isn't it? The way the marriage came about." "Margaret," one of the other women said warningly, "perhaps we should—" "Oh, I'm sure Mrs. Calder doesn't mind discussing it," Margaret continued, eyes locked on Leora like a cat watching a mouse. "After all, the whole town knows her family was drowning in debt, that her father made an arrangement with Mr. Calder to clear it. I'm simply curious. Was it your idea or his?" The cruelty wasn't even veiled anymore. This was what Margaret had wanted all along, to publicly humiliate Leora, to make her admit in front of everyone that she'd been bought. Leora could feel every eye on her, could feel her face getting hot. For a moment she wanted to run, to prove every terrible thing they thought about her by breaking down or lashing out. But then she remembered Rhett's words. "You belong anywhere you decide you want to belong." And something inside her hardened into steel. Leora set down her teacup with deliberate care. Her hands weren't shaking anymore. Something had shifted inside her in the space between Margaret's question and this moment. Something that felt like anger crystallizing into clarity. "You want to know whose idea it was?" Leora said quietly. The room was so silent she could hear the clock ticking on the wall. "It was my father's idea. He came to Rhett with a problem and Rhett offered a solution. I didn't have a say in it. I was told 3 weeks before the wedding, and I spent every one of those weeks terrified." Margaret's eyes gleamed with something that looked like triumph. She'd gotten what she wanted, an admission of weakness, of victimhood. But Leora wasn't done. You want to call it being bought? Fine, call it that. My father sold me to save his farm, and Rhett paid the price because he's a better man than most in this town. She looked directly at Margaret. But here's what you're missing. I could have run, could have refused, could have let my family lose everything rather than marry a stranger. But I didn't. I made a choice. Maybe not a good one, maybe not the one I wanted, but it was mine. She stood up, and several women leaned back like she might do something unpredictable. And you know what else? I'm still choosing. Every day I choose to stay at that ranch. Every day I choose to make something out of a situation that started as a disaster. You call it shame. I call it survival. And if you think I'm going to sit here and let you pick apart my life for entertainment, you're wrong. Her voice had risen without her meaning it to. Emma was outright grinning now. A few other women looked shocked but not disapproving. And Margaret's face had gone red, her composure finally cracking. How dare you speak to me? No, how dare you? Leora's voice was steady now, powered by something she hadn't known she possessed. How dare you invite me here just to humiliate me? How dare you act like your marriages are so much better, so much purer, when half of you married for money or status or to escape something worse? The only difference between me and you is that I'm honest about it. That's enough, Margaret snapped, standing up. I think you should leave. I think you're right. Leora picked up her gloves from the chair. Thank you for the tea. She walked toward the door with her head high, refusing to hurry, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her run. Behind her, the room erupted in whispers. Just before she reached the door, Emma called out, Mrs. Calder? Leora turned. Emma was smiling. I think you're the bravest person I've met in this town. Leora nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and walked out. Rhett was waiting in the church courtyard, leaning against the wagon with his arms crossed. When he saw her face, he straightened immediately. What happened? I told them the truth, Leora said. Her voice was shaking now that the adrenaline was wearing off. And then I told Margaret Whitaker to go to hell. Not in those exact words, but close enough. For a moment, Rhett just stared at her. Then he started laughing, a real laugh, the kind she'd never heard from him before. It transformed his whole face. You told Margaret Whitaker to go to hell? He repeated, like he couldn't quite believe it. More or less. Christ, I wish I'd been there to see it. He was still grinning. Come on, let's get out of here before they form a mob. They climbed into the wagon and left Copper Ridge behind. Leora didn't look back this time. Didn't want to. They were halfway home when the weight of what she'd done really hit her. She'd just burned every bridge she might have had in this town. Had made an enemy of the most influential woman in Copper Ridge. Had probably embarrassed Rhett in front of everyone who mattered. I'm sorry, she said quietly. Rhett glanced at her. For what? For making a scene. For probably damaging your reputation. So stop. He pulled the wagon to a halt, turned to face her fully. You have nothing to apologize for. Those women have been running roughshod over this town for years, and nobody's ever had the guts to stand up to them. What you did back there, that took courage. Or stupidity. Same thing sometimes. His expression softened. I meant what I said before. You belong anywhere you decide to belong, and if Copper Ridge doesn't want you, then to hell with Copper Ridge. Leora felt something loosen in her chest. You're not angry? Angry? I'm proud of you. He said it simply, like it was obvious. You didn't let them make you small. That matters. They sat there in the middle of the road, the winter sun filtering through bare branches, and Leora felt something shift between them again. Something deeper than partnership, more complicated than friendship. Thank you, she said, for being on my side. Always, Rhett said. Then he clicked to the horses, and they continued home. That night, Leora lay in bed replaying the scene in the church hall over and over. Part of her was mortified by her outburst. But another part, a part that was growing stronger, felt something like pride. She'd stood up for herself, had refused to be diminished. The cost of that defiance would probably be high. Margaret wasn't the type to forget or forgive. But for the first time since this whole mess started, Leora felt like she'd actually chosen something instead of just accepting what was handed to her. She heard movement from Rhett's room and wondered if he was having trouble sleeping too. Wondered if he was thinking about what happened. Wondered what he really thought of her now. The questions kept her awake until dawn. Over the next week, the fallout from the church gathering became clear. Word spread quickly about what Leora had said about the confrontation with Margaret. Some versions were accurate. Others were wildly exaggerated. By the time the story made it back to the ranch via one of the hands, Leora had apparently thrown her teacup at Margaret's head and stormed out cursing. "Is any of that true?" the ranch hand, a young guy named Jake, asked, eyes wide. "Not even close," Leora said, but she could see he was disappointed. The reaction in town was split. Some people thought she'd been disrespectful and inappropriate. Others quietly approved of someone finally putting Margaret in her place. A few, like Emma, sent notes of support that Leora tucked away like treasures. But the damage to her social standing was real. Invitations stopped coming. When she went to town for supplies with Martha, women who'd previously been civil now crossed the street to avoid her. The Vances got questions about whether Leora was all right, whether the marriage was going badly, whether she was becoming difficult. Her mother wrote a worried letter asking what had happened, saying people were telling stories, that maybe Leora should apologize to keep the peace. Leora wrote back, "I'm not apologizing for telling the truth. If that makes me difficult, then I'm difficult." She showed the letter to Martha before sending it, half expecting to be told she was being too harsh. But Martha just smiled. "Good for you, dear. Your mother will come around. She's just worried." "She should be worried about what happens if I become the kind of woman who apologizes for existing," Leora muttered. The isolation was harder than she'd expected, though. Even knowing she'd made the right choice, being shut out hurt. She'd never realized how much she'd counted on belonging somewhere, being part of something larger than herself. Now she was just the difficult wife of Rhett Calder, the woman who couldn't keep her mouth shut. Rhett noticed, of course. He always noticed. "You're quieter," he said one evening over dinner. "Thinking too much." "Just processing." "Processing what?" Leora set down her fork. "Whether I made a huge mistake, whether standing up for myself was worth becoming a pariah." "You're not a pariah." "Margaret Whittaker has made sure half the town won't speak to me." "The half that matters doesn't listen to Margaret Whittaker," Rhett said. He reached across the table and tapped the pile of letters by her plate. "You've gotten what? 5? 6? Notes from women saying they admired what you did. That's more real than 100 fake smiles at church gatherings." He had a point, still. It's lonely. "Yeah," Rhett agreed quietly. "It is. But lonely with your dignity intact is better than belonging to people who only want you if you make yourself small." Leora looked at him across the table. This man who'd chosen isolation over compromise, who'd built a life on his own terms, regardless of what it cost him socially. He understood in a way most people wouldn't. "Is that why you avoid town?" she asked. "Because they want you to be something you're not?" "Partly." He pushed food around his plate. "Also because every time I go, someone asks where I came from, who my people are, why I'm here, and I got tired of deflecting." "You could just tell them." "I could," he agreed, "but then I'd be the tragic orphan instead of the mysterious outsider. Not sure which is worse." Leora thought about that, about how people always wanted to categorize you, to put you in a box that made sense to them, and if you didn't fit, they'd cut off the parts that stuck out until you did. "We're quite a pair," she said, "the mysterious outsider and the difficult wife." Rhett's mouth quirked. "Could be worse. Could be better. Could be," he agreed. "But I'll take honest difficulty over polite misery any day." It became their refrain over the following weeks. When things got hard, when the isolation pressed in, one of them would say it, honest difficulty over polite misery. A reminder that they'd chosen this, chosen each other, chosen to be uncomfortable rather than diminished. December arrived with more snow and temperatures that made the October cold seem mild by comparison. The ranch work became focused on survival, keeping the cattle fed, the pipes from freezing, the house warm. Leora and Rhett fell into rhythms that felt almost domestic. Morning coffee, planning the day's work. Shared meals where conversation came easier. Evenings by the fire reading or playing cards. The door between their rooms stayed unlocked now. Not used, exactly, but unlocked. A symbol of something neither of them wanted to name. Leora found herself noticing things about Rhett she hadn't before. The way he was always careful with his strength, never using it to intimidate. How he listened when she talked, really listened, like her words mattered. The small kindnesses he did without being asked, fixing the sticky hinge on her wardrobe, making sure her favorite coffee was always stocked, checking on her when she was quiet. And sometimes when he thought she wasn't looking, she'd catch him watching her with an expression that made her heart do strange things. She didn't know what to do with any of it. This marriage was supposed to be a transaction, a convenience, but it was becoming something else, something that felt dangerously close to real. The first real test of their changed relationship came in mid-December when one of the ranch hands, an older man named Thomas, got sick. Really sick. Fever, chills, cough that sounded like it was tearing him apart from the inside. Rhett brought him to the house and set him up in one of the spare rooms. Martha tended him, but it became clear quickly that this wasn't something rest and soup would fix. "He needs a doctor," Martha said on the third day. "This is pneumonia, maybe worse. He's not getting better." "Nearest doctor is in Copper Ridge," Rhett said. His jaw was tight. "I'll ride in. Bring him back." In this weather? Leora looked out at the snow still falling. "It's a 4-hour ride each way in good conditions. In this, I know." Rhett was already pulling on his coat. "But Thomas won't make it another day without help. I don't have a choice." Leora made a decision. "I'm coming with you." "No." "Yes." She crossed her arms. "You'll need help if the doctor agrees to come. Someone to ride back with him while you lead. And if something happens to you out there, nothing's going to happen to me." "You don't know that." She grabbed her own coat. "We're partners, remember? Partners show up for each other." Using his own words against him. Rhett's expression shifted through several emotions before landing on resignation. "Fine, but you follow my lead. If I say we turn back, we turn back." "Deal." They set out within the hour, bundled against the cold riding horses that Rhett said were the surest footed in bad weather. The snow was coming down hard, visibility poor. The wind cut through every layer Leora wore, but she kept going, kept following Rhett's dark shape ahead of her, trusting he knew the way, even when she couldn't see the trail. It took 5 hours to reach town. By the time they arrived, Leora's face was numb and she'd lost feeling in her toes. Rhett looked only marginally better. The doctor, a middle-aged man named Harrison, answered his door looking irritated at being disturbed. His expression changed when he saw who was asking. "Mr. Calder, what's wrong?" Rhett explained about Thomas. Harrison listened, then shook his head. "In this weather? I can't make that ride, I'm sorry, but—" "Name your price," Rhett interrupted. "It's not about price. It's about safety. I won't risk—" "Thomas is dying," Leora said. She was so cold the words came out shaky. "Please, we'll get you there safely. We just need you to help him." Harrison looked at her for a long moment, then at Rhett. Then he sighed. "Let me get my bag." The ride back was worse. 3 people, one of whom wasn't used to hard riding in bad conditions. The doctor fell behind twice, and each time Rhett had to circle back and help him. Leora's whole body was one massive ache. The cold had gone past uncomfortable into actual pain, but they made it. Somehow, they made it. Harrison spent 2 hours with Thomas. When he finally emerged from the spare room, he looked tired. "It's pneumonia, advanced, but I've given him medicine that should help if we caught it in time. Keep him warm, keep him hydrated. I'll need to check on him in a few days." "Stay here," Rhett said. "The storm's getting worse. You can head back when it clears." Harrison looked like he wanted to argue, but a gust of wind rattling the windows made his point. "All right, thank you." Martha got him settled in another guest room. Rhett paid him triple his normal fee, and Leora finally let herself collapse into a chair by the fire, so exhausted she could barely keep her eyes open. Rhett sat down beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. Neither of them moved away. "That was stupid," he said quietly. "Probably. Could have gotten us all killed. But it didn't." He looked at her, and there was something in his expression that made Leora's breath catch. "You didn't have to come." "Yes, I did." "Why?" "Because I couldn't stand the thought of you out there alone. Because somewhere along the way you became someone I care about. Because this stopped being just a transaction and became something I can't quite name." But she didn't say any of that, just partners. Rhett held her gaze for a moment longer, then nodded. His hand found hers between them, squeezed once, and let go. They sat by the fire until they were both warm again, until the exhaustion became too much to fight. until Martha shooed them off to bed with the promise that she'd watch over Thomas through the night. Leora climbed the stairs feeling like she might fall asleep on her feet. She made it to her room, managed to change into her nightgown, and collapsed onto the bed without even bothering to braid her hair. She was almost asleep when she heard the soft knock on the connecting door. "Come in," she called, too tired to wonder what Rhett wanted. He opened the door, but didn't come through. Just stood there in the doorway, backlit by the lamp in his room. "I wanted to say thank you," he said, "for today, for risking yourself for one of my men. You didn't have to do that." "He's one of our men," Leora corrected. "And yes, I did." Rhett was quiet for a moment. Then, "You're a good person," Leora called her. "Better than I deserve." Before she could respond to that, before she could tell him that he had it backwards, that he was the good one, he'd said goodnight and closed the door. Leora lay in the dark, thinking about that moment by the fire, about his hand finding hers, about the way he'd looked at her like she mattered, like she was something precious that he was afraid to break. When had this happened? When had her husband stopped being a stranger and become the person she most wanted to see each morning? When had his approval become the thing she craved most? She didn't have answers, but lying there in the dark, warm and safe in a house that was starting to feel like home, Leora realized something that should have terrified her, but instead felt like relief. She was falling in love with Rhett Calder. The realization kept her awake for hours, turning it over in her mind like the compass he'd given her, trying to understand how she'd ended up here. This wasn't supposed to happen. This marriage was supposed to stay safe, separate, a business arrangement dressed up in vows. But life, Leora was learning, rarely stayed where you tried to keep it. Thomas recovered slowly over the next week. Dr. Harrison stayed through the worst of it, riding back to town only when the storm cleared and his patient was clearly on the mend. He shook Rhett's hand at the door and told him he had good people working for him. "They're loyal to you," Harrison observed. "That says something about how you treat them." After he left, Rhett seemed uncomfortable with the praise. "I just pay fair wages," he muttered. "You do more than that," Leora said. She'd seen it over the past months, the way Rhett made sure his men had decent housing, good food, medical care when they needed it. He treated them like people, not property. "You care about them. They work hard. They deserve to be taken care of." It was such a simple philosophy, but Leora had seen enough men treat their workers like disposable tools to know it wasn't common. Rhett's father had taught him something valuable before losing everything. Some lessons you kept even after everything else was gone. Christmas approached with little fanfare. There were no parties to attend, no invitations arriving, just the ranch and the people on it getting through winter one day at a time. Martha asked if they wanted to do anything special. Leora looked at Rhett, who shrugged. "Never been much for celebrating," he admitted. "Me neither," Leora said. "Not anymore. Christmas used to mean family gatherings, Claire's excitement, her mother's cooking. Now it just felt like another day that highlighted everything she'd lost." But Martha wouldn't hear it. "We're doing something," she insisted. "Even if it's just a nice dinner and a cake. Life's hard enough without skipping the good parts." So they did. A small celebration, just the four of them, Leora, Rhett, Martha, and Thomas, who was well enough to join them at the table. Martha cooked a feast. There was pie and cake and coffee spiked with whiskey. And when Rhett pulled out a small wrapped package and slid it across the table to Leora, she felt her throat get tight. "You didn't have to. Just open it." Inside was a leather journal, beautiful and well made, with her initials embossed on the cover. L.C. Leora Calder. "I noticed you didn't have one," Rhett said, looking almost embarrassed. "Thought you might want somewhere to write things down. Thoughts, plans, whatever." It was perfect. Thoughtful. The kind of gift that said he'd been paying attention, that he saw her as more than just a wife in name. "Thank you," she managed. "I love it." "Got you something too," she said, pulling out her own wrapped package. She'd worked on it for weeks in secret, staying up late when everyone else was asleep. Rhett unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a scarf she'd knitted, dark blue wool, warm and practical. It wasn't fancy, but every stitch had been made while thinking about keeping him warm on those long, cold rides. "Made it yourself?" he asked, running the fabric through his fingers. "Badly," she admitted. "I'm not great at knitting, but it's warm." "It's perfect." He wrapped it around his neck immediately, and the smile he gave her made her heart stutter. They stayed up late that night, talking and laughing in a way they never had before. Martha told embarrassing stories about Rhett, from when he'd first bought the ranch and didn't know the first thing about running it. Thomas shared tales from his years working different spreads across Montana. Leora talked about Clara and some of the trouble they'd gotten into as kids. For a few hours, it felt like family, like belonging, like home. When Leora finally climbed the stairs to bed, slightly drunk and completely happy, she realized this was the best Christmas she'd had in years. Not despite the circumstances, but maybe because of them. Because these people had chosen to make something good out of what they had. She was writing in her new journal, just simple observations about the day, when she heard Rhett's door open and close, heard his footsteps in the hall. They paused outside her room. Another soft knock. "Come in." He opened the door, still wearing the scarf. "Can't sleep?" "Too much coffee," she lied. Truth was, she didn't want the day to end. Didn't want to let go of the warmth and happiness and return to normal. Rhett leaned against the doorframe. "Good day?" "The best." She set down her pen. "Thank you for the journal and for all of this. For making it feel less lonely. You did that," he said quietly. "Before you came, this house was just a place I lived. Now it's—" He trailed off, like he wasn't sure how to finish. "Now it's what?" "Now it's somewhere I want to be." The words hung between them, weighted with meaning. Leora's heart was hammering so hard she was sure he could hear it. "Rhett, I should let you sleep," he said quickly, pushing off from the doorframe. "Good night, Leora." "Good night." He left, closing the door softly behind him. Leora sat in bed staring at where he'd been, wondering if she'd imagined the way his voice had roughened on those last words, if she'd read too much into the expression on his face, or if maybe, just maybe, he was feeling the same impossible thing she was. The new year came in quietly, marked only by Martha's insistence on making black-eyed peas for luck. Leora and Rhett stood on the porch at midnight, watching stars scatter across the winter sky, neither of them speaking. There was something building between them, something that had been growing slowly since that first ride out to check fences, watered by shared work and quiet dinners and moments of understanding. It was there in the way they moved around each other now, always aware, always careful not to touch, but somehow always finding excuses to be close. It was there in the way Rhett's eyes followed her across a room, in the way Leora found herself listening for his footsteps, relaxing when she knew he was home safe. It was there in the unlocked door between their rooms that neither of them mentioned, but both of them thought about. January brought a cold snap that made December look mild. Temperatures dropped so low that water froze in the pipes despite the fires they kept burning. Going outside meant risking frostbite. The cattle huddled together in the valleys, and all anyone could do was wait for the weather to break. Leora and Rhett were trapped inside together for days. And somewhere in those long hours of forced proximity, something shifted. It started small. Sitting closer together by the fire. Hands brushing when passing items at meals. Conversations that lasted long into the night, covering everything from books they'd read to dreams they'd abandoned. Rhett told her about wanting to be a builder when he was young, about plans he'd had before life took everything. Leora confessed that she'd once wanted to be a teacher, had loved reading to Clara and helping her with lessons. "You still could," Rhett said. "Teach, I mean. Once spring comes and things settle. There's kids on some of the neighboring ranches who don't have access to school. You think anyone would want me teaching their children? After what happened with Margaret? I think people are smarter than you give them credit for. The ones who matter, anyway." He shifted closer on the couch they were sharing. "You'd be good at it. You're patient, smart. You explain things clearly." "How would you know?" she challenged. "Because you've been teaching me," he said simply. "About books, about music, about how to see the world differently. You think I don't notice?" Leora felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I wasn't trying to teach you anything. Best teachers never are. They just share what they love and hope some of it sticks." They were sitting so close now that Leora could feel the warmth radiating from him, could smell the soap he used, the coffee on his breath, the wool of the scarf she'd made that he wore constantly. "Rhett," she said quietly. He looked at her, and the expression in his eyes made her forget whatever she'd been about to say. There was want there. Carefully controlled, banked like coals, but definitely there. "Yeah?" His voice had gone rough. This was the moment. The point where she could either step back or step forward, where their careful arrangement would either hold or shatter completely. Leora chose forward. She kissed him. Just a brief press of lips, uncertain and nervous. But Rhett made a sound low in his throat and his hand came up to cup her face. And then he was kissing her back in a way that made her forget they'd ever been strangers, that this had ever been anything but inevitable. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Rhett pressed his forehead to hers. "We should probably talk about this," he said. "Probably? Because if we keep going—" He trailed off, but his meaning was clear. If they kept going, there was no going back, no maintaining the careful boundaries they'd built. This marriage would become real in every sense. "I know," Leora whispered. "Do you want to stop?" His answer was to kiss her again, deeper this time, pulling her closer until she was practically in his lap. And Leora went willingly, wrapping her arms around his neck, pouring months of longing and confusion and unexpected love into the kiss. They stayed like that for a long time, learning each other, until Martha's footsteps in the hall made them spring apart like guilty teenagers. Rhett stood abruptly, running a hand through his hair. I need to—" "Yeah," Leora agreed, though she had no idea what he was trying to say. He left quickly, retreating to his study. Leora sat on the couch, trying to catch her breath, trying to process what had just happened. She'd kissed her husband had kissed her back, and now everything was different. She went to bed that night with her lips still tingling, her heart racing, and absolutely no idea what came next. The answer apparently was awkwardness. For the next 2 days, she and Rhett barely spoke. They avoided each other as much as possible in a house where avoiding someone was nearly impossible. When they did cross paths, Rhett wouldn't quite meet her eyes, and Leora found herself tongue-tied in a way she hadn't been since the wedding. It was Martha who finally had enough. "All right, what happened?" she demanded, cornering Leora in the kitchen. "Nothing. Don't give me that. 2 days ago, you and Mr. Calder were actually happy. Now you're both skulking around like you've committed a crime. So what happened?" Leora debated lying, but Martha would see through it, and honestly, she needed advice. "We kissed." Martha's eyebrows shot up. "And? And now it's weird. He's avoiding me. I'm avoiding him. I don't know what to do. Have you tried talking to him?" "What would I even say? How about, 'I like you and I think we should figure out what this means for our marriage,'" Martha suggested. Revolutionary concept, I know. What if he regrets it? What if he was just, I don't know, lonely and I was there? Martha gave her a look. "That man has been half in love with you since you stood up to Margaret Whittaker. Probably before that, if I'm honest. The only one who doesn't see it is you." "He's not—" "He is," Martha interrupted firmly, "but he's also terrified of pushing you into something you don't want. So he's waiting for you to make it clear, which you did by kissing him. And now he's probably panicking that he pushed too hard by kissing you back." Leora blinked. "That's ridiculous. That's people." Martha patted her shoulder. "Go talk to him, before you both drive me insane." She found Rhett in his barn, supposedly checking on the horses, but mostly just standing there staring at nothing. He startled when she came in. "Leora, we need to talk," she said. He went very still. "All right." Now that she was here, Leora had no idea how to start, so she just plunged ahead. "About what happened the other night." "I'm sorry," Rhett said immediately. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." "You didn't." He stopped. "What?" "You didn't make me uncomfortable. I kissed you, remember?" She took a breath. "And I'm not sorry about it. Unless you are. In which case we can just forget it happened and go back to how things were. Do you want that?" His voice was careful. "To go back?" "No." The word came out more forcefully than she intended. "No, I don't. I like what we've become. I like you. And I think maybe this could be more than just an arrangement, if you want it to be." Rhett crossed the space between them in 3 long strides. "If I want it to be," he repeated, like the idea was absurd. "Leora, I've wanted that since the day you fell in the creek and came up swearing at that calf. Maybe before. But I couldn't. I wouldn't ask you to be more than you signed up for." "I'm asking," she said. "I'm choosing this. Choosing you. If you'll have me." His answer was to kiss her again, and this time there was nothing uncertain about it. This was a promise, a beginning. When they finally came up for air, Rhett was smiling, really smiling, the kind that reached his eyes and made him look years younger. "So we're doing this?" he asked. "Making this real?" "I think we've been real for a while now," Leora said. "We were just too stubborn to admit it." He laughed and pulled her close, and Leora rested her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat, feeling more settled than she had in months. This wasn't the marriage she'd imagined as a girl. Wasn't the fairy tale with grand romance and perfect moments. It was built on desperation and survival and two broken people finding their way towards something whole. But it was real. It was hers. It was theirs. And that was enough. That night, for the first time since the wedding, Leora didn't sleep in her own bed. She'd expected it to be awkward, this crossing of the final boundary between them. Expected nerves or second thoughts or the weight of propriety telling her this was too fast, too much. But when Rhett led her upstairs, fingers laced with hers, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. His room was larger than hers, darker, filled with the scent of leather and wood smoke and something distinctly him. He lit a lamp on the bedside table, and in the warm glow, Leora saw vulnerability flash across his face. "We can take this slow," he said. "There's no rush. We have time." Leora stepped closer, close enough to feel the heat of him. "I've spent months being careful, being restrained. I don't want careful anymore." Something ignited in his eyes. "You're sure?" Instead of answering, she kissed him. And this time when he pulled her close, there was no hesitation, no holding back. Just two people who'd been circling each other for months finally allowing themselves to fall. Later, wrapped in blankets with Rhett's arm around her and her head on his chest, Leora felt a peace she'd never experienced before. This was what marriage was supposed to feel like. Not a cage or an obligation, but a choice you made over and over, every day choosing the person beside you. "What are you thinking?" Rhett asked, his voice rumbling through his chest. "That I was wrong about you." "Yeah? I thought you were cold, unfeeling. Turned out you were just waiting for someone to see past the walls." His arm tightened around her. "You make it sound simple. Isn't it?" "Nothing about this is simple," Rhett said quietly. 6 months ago, I was alone in this house thinking that was how I'd die. Alone. And now you're here and everything's different, and sometimes I wake up terrified that it's temporary, that you'll realize you can do better and leave." Leora propped herself up on one elbow to look at him. "I'm not going anywhere." "You say that now? I mean it." She put her hand over his heart. "I chose this. I choose you. And I'll keep choosing you until you believe it." Rhett pulled her down for a kiss that said more than words could. When they finally broke apart, he pressed his forehead to hers. "I love you," he said, simple, direct, absolutely terrifying. Leora's breath caught. They'd been dancing around it for weeks, maybe months, but hearing him say it out loud made it real in a way that nothing else had. "I love you too," she whispered back, "even though you're stubborn and brooding and terrible at talking about your feelings." He laughed, the sound vibrating through both of them. "You're not exactly easy yourself." "No," she agreed, "but we work anyway." They fell asleep like that, tangled together. And for the first time since the wedding, Leora didn't dream about her old life or the future she'd lost. She just slept, deep and dreamless and safe. Morning came with winter sunlight streaming through windows Leora had never seen from this angle. She woke slowly, aware of warmth beside her, a weight across her waist that turned out to be Rhett's arm. He was still asleep, face relaxed in a way it never was when he was awake, dark hair falling across his forehead. Leora let herself just look at him, her husband. Her partner. Her choice. His eyes opened and he caught her staring. "Morning," he said, voice rough with sleep. "Morning. Any regrets?" "None." She traced her finger along his jaw. "You?" "Only that we wasted so much time being careful." They stayed in bed longer than they should have, talking quietly, learning each other in this new context. Eventually, Martha's voice drifted up from downstairs calling them for breakfast, and reality reasserted itself. "We should probably go down," Leora said reluctantly. "Probably." But Rhett made no move to let her go. "She's going to know. She already knows. Martha knows everything." Leora laughed and finally extracted herself from his arms. She gathered her nightgown from where it had ended up on the floor, suddenly aware of being naked in daylight. Rhett watched her dress with an expression that made her blush. "Stop looking at me like that," she said. "Like what?" "Like you're thinking about undressing me again. Can't help what I'm thinking." She threw a pillow at him, which he caught easily, grinning. This playfulness was new, this ease. Leora loved it. When they finally made it downstairs, Martha took one look at them and smiled. "About time," was all she said, but her tone was warm. The next few weeks passed in a blur of happiness that Leora had never thought possible. She and Rhett were inseparable, working together during the day, falling into bed together at night. The careful distance they'd maintained for months dissolved completely, replaced by a closeness that felt as natural as breathing. But the world outside their ranch didn't stop turning just because they'd found each other. In early February, a letter arrived from Leora's mother. Her father was sick. Nothing serious, the letter insisted, just a bad cold that had lingered too long. But reading between the lines, Leora could hear her mother's worry. "I should go see them," she told Rhett that evening. "Want me to come with you?" "No, I mean, yes, but—" She struggled to articulate it. "I need to do this on my own. Face them as myself, not as your wife. Does that make sense?" "It does." He kissed her temple. "But if you need me, send word. I'll come." She left the next morning with one of the ranch hands as escort. The ride to her family's farm felt both endless and too short. What would she say to them? How did you explain to your parents that the marriage they'd forced on you had somehow become the best thing in your life? The farmhouse looked smaller than she remembered. Shabby in a way she hadn't noticed before, with repairs that hadn't been made and paint that was peeling. But smoke rose from the chimney, and when she knocked, Clara opened the door and launched herself at Leora with a shriek of joy. "You're home!" "Just visiting," Leora corrected, but she hugged her sister tight. Clara had grown in the months since the wedding, was almost as tall as Leora now. When had that happened? Her mother appeared, wiping her hands on her apron, and the relief in her expression made Leora's throat tight. "Leora, thank heavens, come in, come in." Her father was in bed, looking pale, but not as bad as Leora had feared. He tried to sit up when she entered, but she waved him back down. "Stay put. How are you feeling?" "Fine. Your mother's fussing over nothing." "He's been coughing for 3 weeks," her mother said sharply. "That's not nothing." They fell into familiar patterns of bickering that made Leora smile despite herself. Some things never changed. She spent the afternoon helping her mother with chores and catching up with Clara, who wanted to know everything about ranch life. Did they have horses? Could Leora ride whenever she wanted? Was the house really as big as people said? "It's big," Leora confirmed. "Too big, honestly. Half the rooms are empty." "Are you happy there?" Clara asked, suddenly serious. "Really happy? Or are you just saying that?" Leora thought about how to answer. "I'm happy. It wasn't what I expected, but it's good. Better than good. Even though you didn't choose it." "I did choose it," Leora said. "Maybe not at first, but I'm choosing it now, every day." Clara seemed to accept this. "Mr. Calder treats you well?" "He does. He's—" Leora smiled without meaning to. "He's a good man. I'm lucky." Her sister studied her face, then grinned. "You love him." "What?" "You do. You get this look when you talk about him." Clara laughed. "Who would have thought? The marriage everyone said was a disaster turns out to be a love match after all." Leora wanted to protest, but what was the point? It was true. Somehow, against all odds, it was true. That evening, after Clara went to bed, Leora sat with her parents by the fire. The silence was heavy with things unsaid. Finally, her father spoke. "I owe you an apology." Leora looked up, surprised. Her father wasn't the apologizing type. "I had no right to make that choice for you," he continued, staring into the flames. "No right to trade your future for my pride. I told myself it was the only way, that you'd understand someday. But the truth is, I was desperate and scared, and I took the easy way out." "It wasn't easy," her mother added quietly. "We've barely slept since the wedding, wondering if we did the right thing, if you were safe, if you'd ever forgive us." Leora felt tears sting her eyes. "I'm not going to lie and say it was okay. What you did, forcing me into that marriage without asking, that hurt. That wasn't fair." "I know," her father said. But, Leora continued, something strange happened. That terrible decision turned into something good. He's more than I expected, more than I knew to hope for. So while I'm still angry about how it happened, I can't regret where I ended up. Her mother was crying now, silent tears running down her face. You really are happy? I really am. They talked for hours after that, really talked in a way they never had before. Leora told them about the ranch, about Margaret Whitaker and the church gathering, about learning to ride and work cattle. She told them about Martha and Thomas and the strange little family she'd found. She didn't tell them everything. Some things were too private, too new to share. But she told them enough that when she left the next morning, her father hugged her tight and her mother made her promise to visit more often. Bring your husband next time, her mother said. I'd like to know him better, know the man my daughter chose. Chose. Not was sold to. Not married out of obligation. Chose. It felt like healing. The ride back to the ranch felt different than the ride out. Lighter. Like she'd shed some weight she hadn't known she was carrying. Rhett was waiting on the porch when she arrived, and the way his whole face lit up when he saw her made Leora's heart skip. He helped her down from her horse and pulled her into a kiss that the ranch hand politely pretended not to see. How was it? Rhett asked. Good, strange, good, Leora said. They apologized. Yeah? And they want to meet you properly. As my husband, not just the man who paid their debt. Rhett looked nervous. You want that? I do. She took his hand. They're my family, and you're my family now too. I want those things to fit together. He nodded slowly. All right. We can arrange that. They walked into the house together, and Leora felt a contentment settle over her that she'd never experienced before. This was home. These people were hers, and she was exactly where she belonged. But contentment, Leora was about to learn, was a fragile thing. The trouble started in mid-March when one of the ranch hands came back from town with gossip. Margaret Whitaker had been talking, spreading rumors that Rhett had only married Leora to acquire her family's land, that there were plans to foreclose on the Vance farm and add it to the Calder holdings. It was completely false. Rhett had no interest in her family's struggling property, and the debt had been cleared with no strings attached. But Margaret had never let facts get in the way of a good story. People are talking, the hand said apologetically, saying Mrs. Calder is in on it, that the whole thing was a scheme from the start. Rhett's expression went dark. That's bullshit and everyone knows it. Maybe, but it's spreading, thought you should know. After he left, Rhett paced the kitchen like a caged animal. I should ride into town, confront her, make her stop spreading lies. That's exactly what she wants, Leora said. For you to lose your temper and prove you're the villain she's painted you as. So we just let her lie? No, but we don't give her ammunition either. Leora thought for a moment. We need to show people the truth, not by defending ourselves, but by being visible, together. Let them see that this marriage is real. How? The spring fair is coming up. Everyone in the valley attends. We go. We participate. We show them we're not hiding. Rhett looked skeptical. You want to voluntarily walk into a town that's already gossiping about us? I want to stop running from gossip and start facing it head on. Leora crossed her arms. Besides, we have nothing to be ashamed of. Let them look. Let them judge. We know the truth. It was a bold plan. Maybe a stupid one. But Rhett finally nodded. All right, we'll go to the fair. Together. The spring fair was Copper Ridge's biggest event, a celebration that marked the end of winter and the beginning of planting season. There were contests for livestock and baking, games for children, dancing in the evening. The whole valley turned out. Leora spent the week before the fair in a state of controlled anxiety. She knew what they were walking into, a public examination of their marriage, their relationship, their right to exist as a couple. Every eye would be on them, every interaction scrutinized for cracks. We could still back out, Rhett said the night before. No, we're doing this. You sure? Leora thought about the life they'd built over the past months, the love they'd found in the wreckage of an arranged marriage, the way they'd chosen each other when they could have chosen distance. I'm sure. We have nothing to hide. They arrived at the fair mid-morning when the crowds were already thick. Leora wore her best dress, the green one Martha had helped her make, with embroidery at the collar that had taken weeks. Rhett was in a suit that made him look uncomfortable, but undeniably handsome. The moment they stepped into the fairgrounds, conversation stopped. Heads turned. The whispers started immediately. Rhett's hand found hers, squeezed once. Ready? Ready? They walked through the fair together, refusing to slink or hide. When people stared, Leora met their eyes. When whispers followed them, she kept her head high. They stopped at the livestock pens where Thomas was showing one of their bulls. He greeted them warmly, and they spent time talking about the animal's prospects, appearing completely comfortable. A small crowd gathered to watch, and Leora was aware of being studied like a specimen. At the baking tent, Emma waved them over. "Mrs. Calder, you should enter the pie contest. I bet yours would win." "I didn't bring one," Leora said. "Next year, then." Emma's smile was genuine, and Leora felt a rush of gratitude for this woman who'd been kind when kindness was scarce. They ran into Margaret near the main stage. She was holding court with her usual group of followers, but when she saw Leora and Rhett, her expression soured. "Mr. and Mrs. Calder," she said, voice dripping with false sweetness. "How surprising to see you here." "Why would it be surprising?" Leora asked pleasantly. "We live in this valley same as everyone else." Of course, I simply meant, well, with all the talk about your unusual arrangement, I thought you might prefer to stay out of sight." Rhett's jaw tightened, but Leora spoke before he could. "Our arrangement is called marriage, Mrs. Whitaker. Perhaps you've heard of it." A few people nearby snickered. Margaret's face flushed. "I was merely concerned," she said stiffly. "Some of us take our social responsibilities seriously." "And some of us take our actual responsibilities seriously," Leora countered, "which is why we're here instead of sitting around gossiping about our neighbors." It was a direct hit, and everyone knew it. Margaret looked like she wanted to say more, but Catherine Morrison, one of her usual supporters, touched her arm warningly. "Ladies," Catherine said with a forced smile, "perhaps we should all just enjoy the fair." Margaret swept away with as much dignity as she could muster, her followers trailing behind. As soon as they were out of earshot, Emma burst out laughing. "Did you see her face? I thought she was going to explode." "Probably shouldn't have provoked her," Leora admitted. "Absolutely should have," Emma said firmly. "Someone needs to stand up to her. She's been terrorizing this town for years." As the day wore on, Leora noticed a shift. People were still watching them, still whispering, but some of the whispers seemed more curious than condemning. A few women approached to ask about the ranch, about Martha's recipes, about where Leora had gotten her dress. It wasn't acceptance exactly, but it was a crack in the wall. The real test came in the evening when the dancing started. Rhett looked at the couples gathering near the stage with obvious reluctance. "I should warn you," he said. "I'm terrible at dancing." "Good thing I'm not much better." Leora held out her hand. "Come on. Everyone's watching anyway. Might as well give them something to see." He took her hand and led her onto the floor. The music started, a waltz, simple and slow, and they began to move. Rhett wasn't lying about being terrible. He was stiff and awkward, counting steps under his breath. But Leora didn't care, because even stumbling through a basic waltz, there was something perfect about being in his arms in front of everyone, publicly claiming what they'd found together. "You're smiling," Rhett observed. "I'm happy." "Even with half the town staring at us." "Especially with half the town staring," Leora said. "Let them see. Let them know this is real." Rhett pulled her a little closer, propriety be damned. "I love you," he said, quiet enough that only she could hear. "I love you too." They danced through 3 songs, and by the third, other couples had joined them, the attention diffusing. When they finally left the floor, Leora caught sight of her parents, and Clara standing near the edge of the crowd. Her mother was crying, but she was smiling too. Leora excused herself from Rhett and made her way over. Her mother hugged her immediately. "You look so happy," she said through tears. "Both of you. Anyone can see it. We are happy, Mama." Her father nodded toward Rhett, who was getting punched for both of them. "He's good to you?" "The best." "Then I did something right after all." Father's voice was gruff. "Even if I did it for the wrong reasons." Clara hugged Leora from behind. "Everyone's talking about how in love you two are. Margaret Whitaker looks like she ate a lemon." "Clara," their mother scolded, but she was laughing. Leora stayed with her family for a while, introducing them properly to Rhett when he joined them. Watching her father shake Rhett's hand with actual respect, seeing Clara pepper him with questions about the horses, feeling her mother's approval, it felt like pieces clicking into place. By the time they left the fair, twilight was painting the sky purple and gold. The ride home was quiet, both of them tired but satisfied.
That went better than I expected, Rhett admitted. We did good. Showed them we're not ashamed.
We're not, he agreed. We have nothing to be ashamed of. Back at the ranch, they fell into bed exhausted but content. Leora curled into Rhett's side, her head on his shoulder, feeling utterly at peace. Thank you, she said into the darkness. For what? For being brave enough to show up today. For holding my hand in front of everyone. For choosing me in public, not just in private.
I'll always choose you,
Rhett said simply. Public, private, doesn't matter. You're mine and I'm yours, and everyone else can deal with it. Mine and yours. The words settled into Leora's heart like a promise. But promises, she was about to discover, were easier to make than to keep. The blow came 2 weeks later, delivered by a lawyer from Billings who rode up to the ranch looking official and unwelcome. Rhett met him on the porch, Leora standing beside him. Can I help you? The lawyer consulted his papers. Mr. Rhett Calder? That's me. I'm here on behalf of the Montana Territorial Bank. They're calling in a loan taken out 18 months ago for the sum of $8,000, plus accrued interest. The payment is now 60 days overdue. Rhett went very still. I paid that loan off 6 months ago. I have no record of that payment. Then your records are wrong. Rhett's voice was hard. I paid it in full. I have the receipt. May I see it? Rhett disappeared into his study and returned 5 minutes later looking pale. It's not here. It should be in my files, but it's not. The lawyer's expression was professionally sympathetic. Without proof of payment, the bank considers the loan in default. They're demanding immediate payment of the full amount plus penalties, or they'll begin foreclosure proceedings on the ranch. Leora felt ice slide down her spine. How much? $10,000, due in 30 days. It might as well have been $1 million. Even for Rhett, that much cash on short notice would be nearly impossible to raise. After the lawyer left, Rhett stood on the porch staring out at his land, the land he'd built from nothing, the land that represented everything he'd clawed back from loss. It's the bank manager, he said flatly. Whitaker, Margaret's husband. This is revenge for the fair for you standing up to his wife. You don't know that? I know exactly that. Rhett's hands were fists. The receipt was in my files. I saw it last month. Now it's conveniently gone, and the bank has no record of payment. This is deliberate. Leora's mind raced. We fight it. We get a lawyer. We prove fraud. With what evidence? The receipt is gone. My word against the bank's records. Rhett laughed bitterly. I've seen this before. Watched it happen to my father. They'll tie it up in courts until the deadline passes, then foreclose anyway. So what do we do? Rhett was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was hollow. I could sell. There are buyers who'd pay enough to clear the debt and have something left over. We could start somewhere else. The thought of leaving this place, the home they'd built together, the life they'd created, made Leora feel physically sick, but she could see the calculation in Rhett's eyes, the way he was already preparing himself for loss. No, she said firmly. Leora, no. We're not selling, we're not running. This is our home. She grabbed his arm, made him look at her. We'll find another way. There is no other way. Then we'll make one. Rhett pulled her into his arms, and she felt him trembling. I can't lose this. I can't lose everything again. You won't, Leora promised, even though she had no idea how to keep that promise. We won't. We'll figure something out. But lying in bed that night, listening to Rhett's restless breathing beside her, Leora wondered if she'd just made a promise she couldn't keep. $10,000 in 30 days seemed impossible, unless she did the one thing she'd sworn she'd never do. The idea came to her in the dark hours before dawn, when Rhett had finally fallen into exhausted sleep and Leora was staring at the ceiling trying to find solutions where none existed. Her family's farm. It was small, struggling, but it had value. If she went to her father, explained the situation, maybe he could take out a loan against it. Use that money to help Rhett pay off the bank. It would put her family right back in debt, the same debt they'd just escaped by selling her into marriage. It would be asking them to sacrifice again for her sake. But it might be the only option they had. Leora spent the next week agonizing over whether to ask. She watched Rhett grow quieter, more withdrawn, as the weight of potentially losing everything pressed down on him. Watched him ride the property like he was memorizing it, preparing for goodbye. Finally, she made her decision. She would go to her father and ask. But when she arrived at her family's farm, she found it in chaos. Her mother met her at the door, face pale. "Leora, thank heaven. Your father collapsed yesterday. Dr. Harrison says it's his heart. We don't know if... We're not sure he'll..." All thoughts of asking for money fled. Leora spent the next 3 days at her father's bedside, watching him fight for each breath, terrified she'd lose him. He survived, but barely. Dr. Harrison was clear. No stress, no hard work, complete rest for months if he wanted to live. The idea of asking her family to take on more debt died completely. She couldn't do it. Couldn't risk her father's life for the ranch, no matter how much it meant to her. She rode back to Calder Ranch feeling defeated. 20 days left. No solutions. No hope. Rhett was waiting on the porch. He took one look at her face and knew. "Your family can't help. My father's sick, his heart. I can't ask them for anything right now." Rhett nodded slowly, like he'd expected this. "Then I'll sell. Start making arrangements." "Rhett, no. What choice do I have?" His voice cracked. "I won't risk you losing your father because I'm too proud to let go of land. I won't put that on you." Leora wanted to argue, but she had no ammunition. He was right. They were out of options. That night, lying in their bed with Rhett's arms around her, Leora made a different decision. She would leave. Not forever. Just long enough to go somewhere Rhett wouldn't follow, to find a solution he'd never accept if he knew about it. She'd heard stories about women who worked in the cities, who found employment that paid well enough to save, to build stakes. It was dangerous, possibly stupid. But it was something, and something was better than watching the man she loved lose everything while she stood by helpless. She wrote the letter after Rhett fell asleep, her hand shaking so hard she could barely form the words. "By the time you read this, I'll be gone. Not because I don't love you, I do, more than I can say, but because loving you means I can't watch you sacrifice everything. I'm going to find a way to help, a way to save what we've built. Trust me, wait for me. I'll come back. I promise I'll come back." She left it on his pillow before dawn, kissed his sleeping face one last time, and slipped out of the house with nothing but the clothes on her back and the compass he'd given her, the compass to help her find her way back home. Leora made it 3 miles before she realized what a terrible mistake she'd made. She sat alone on the empty road as dawn broke, her horse shifting restlessly beneath her, and understood with sudden clarity that running was the worst possible choice, not just for Rhett, but for herself. She'd spent months learning to stand her ground, to fight instead of flee, and here she was repeating the same pattern of helplessness she'd sworn to leave behind. She turned around. Rhett was on the porch when she rode up, her letter crumpled in his fist. He pulled her from the horse before she could dismount properly, holding her so tight she could barely breathe. "Don't ever do that again," he said, voice shaking. "Don't ever leave like that." "I won't. I'm sorry. I couldn't stand feeling helpless." "So you thought making me feel helpless was better?" He pulled back to look at her. "We're in this together, Leora. That means we face things together." Martha appeared with coffee neither of them wanted, and Thomas joined them as Rhett explained the bank situation again. The missing receipt, the impossible deadline, the certainty of loss. "Unless we find that receipt," Leora said slowly, "it existed. You saw it last month. Someone took it." "Margaret," Martha said, "she was here about a month ago for that charity thing. You left her alone in the hall while you got your checkbook." Understanding dawned on Rhett's face. "She could have gone into my study." "So the receipt might still exist," Leora pressed, "hidden somewhere in their house." "And you're proposing what exactly?" Rhett's voice was flat. "Breaking in to search for it?" "Thursday afternoons, Margaret has her ladies' meeting. The servants get Thursday evenings off. The house is mostly empty." Leora met his eyes. "It's a risk, but we're out of options." They argued for an hour, but Leora wouldn't budge. Finally, reluctantly, Rhett agreed to help plan it. Thomas volunteered to act as lookout. And 2 days later, Leora found herself slipping through the unlocked side door of the Whitaker house while Thomas kept watch from across the street. The house was silent, empty. Leora moved through it like a ghost, checking the parlor, the study, before heading upstairs to Margaret's bedroom. She found the receipt in Margaret's jewelry box, hidden beneath pearls and brooches. Proof of payment, dated 6 months ago, signed and stamped. Leora had just pocketed it when she heard voices downstairs. Her blood went cold. The Whitakers were home early. She heard Thomas outside creating a distraction, shouting about a loose horse, and knew she had minutes at most. Margaret's footsteps started up the stairs. Leora stepped into the hallway just as Margaret reached the top. They stared at each other. "What are you doing in my house?" Margaret demanded. Leora's mind raced. She could run, but that would make everything worse. She could lie, but Margaret wouldn't believe her, which left only the truth. "I came for the receipt you stole from my husband's study," Leora said quietly. "The one you used to destroy us." Margaret's face went white, then red. "I have no idea." "Yes, you do." Leora pulled the receipt from her pocket. "I found it in your jewelry box, right where you hid it after stealing it from Rhett's files." For a moment, Margaret looked genuinely frightened. Then her composure snapped back. "Get out of my house before I call the sheriff." "Go ahead," Leora said. "Call him. We can explain together why you had this receipt, why your husband claimed a loan was unpaid when it wasn't. I'm sure a judge would be interested." She walked past Margaret and down the stairs, half expecting to be stopped. But Margaret just stood frozen, and Leora made it out. Thomas fell in beside her as they walked to the livery. "You got it?" "I got it." They rode straight to Billings and found a lawyer, a sharp woman named Catherine Frost, who had no connection to Copper Ridge. She examined the receipt and smiled grimly. "This is fraud, clear as day. I'll file an emergency injunction today." The injunction was granted within 2 days. The audit was ordered, and when the bank's records were examined, they found a pattern. Dozens of altered documents, falsified loans, properties seized through manufactured debts. Whitaker had done this before, many times. He tried to flee but was caught in Wyoming. Margaret claimed ignorance, but the receipt in her jewelry box told a different story. The trial happened in late spring, and Whitaker was convicted. Margaret lost everything: her status, her influence, her social standing. More importantly, families who'd lost their farms started getting them back. The money that had been stolen was returned. Rhett's debt was declared paid in full. Standing on the courthouse steps after the verdict, Leora didn't feel triumphant, just tired and relieved. "How do you feel?" Rhett asked. "Like, I want to go home." As they rode back to the ranch, Rhett pulled his horse to a stop on the final hill overlooking their land. "I need to tell you something," he said. He dismounted and helped her down, then pulled out a folded document. "This is the deed to the ranch. I'm having your name added to it, not as my wife who shares my property, but as equal owner, 50-50. Leora stared at him. "You don't have to." "I want to. You fought for this place as hard as I did. You earned it, and I want everyone to know you're not property. You're a person with power in your own right." The deed was filed the following week. People talked, of course, some scandalized that a woman would own property in her own name, others calling Rhett foolish for giving away half his wealth. But Leora didn't care what they thought anymore. Summer brought growth. The ranch prospered under their joint management. Leora started teaching children from neighboring ranches, gathering them in the barn 3 days a week. She reconciled fully with her family, visiting monthly, sometimes bringing Clara to stay at the ranch. And in August, over tea in the kitchen, Emma announced she was pregnant. "I don't know how to be a mother," Emma confessed. "What if I'm terrible at it?" "Then you'll learn," Leora said. "Same as everyone else." The words stayed with her. That night on the porch, she asked Rhett, "Do you want children?" He was quiet for a moment, then, "I never let myself want them before. But now, yeah, I want them, if you do." "I do," Leora said. "Someday." "Someday?" he agreed, pulling her close. Fall brought a letter from Catherine Frost. The recovered funds from the bank fraud were being used to establish a relief fund for families facing foreclosure. They wanted to name it after Rhett and Leora. "Your story has inspired people," Frost wrote. "This could be your legacy." They agreed. The Calder Relief Fund was established with newspapers running stories about the farm girl and the rancher who'd fought corrupt bankers and won. Winter came again, the second Lyora would spend at the ranch. But this time there was no uncertainty, no careful distance. Just home and family and love that had been earned through hardship and choice. On Christmas Eve, Lyora stood outside looking at the land stretching in every direction, their land. She thought about the terrified girl she'd been a year ago, convinced her life was over. That girl had been wrong. "You coming inside?" Rhett called. Martha made pie. Leora smiled and walked toward the house, toward warmth and laughter, and the life she'd built from wreckage. That night, she wrote in her journal, "A year ago, I thought marriage to a stranger was the end. Turned out it was the beginning. I learned that freedom isn't the absence of obligation. It's the presence of choice. That love isn't something that happens to you. It's something you decide to do, over and over. I learned I'm stronger than I knew. That home isn't a place you're born into. It's something you build with your own hands, alongside people who choose to build it with you. Whatever comes next, I'll face it with choice, with courage, with love. Not because my story started perfectly, but because I decided to make it end well." She closed the journal and found Rhett waiting in the doorway. "You coming to bed?" "I was just thinking about planting tulips in spring," she said. "The kind that take years to establish but last forever." "Sounds perfect," Rhett said, pulling her close. They walked down the hall hand in hand, two people who'd started as strangers bound by desperation and become partners bound by choice. Behind them, the house settled into quiet. Snow fell softly outside. And somewhere in the darkness, the future waited. Not perfect, not guaranteed, but theirs to shape however they chose. Together. Always together.